Hey all, this is retold. Today I want to talk about the Zelda timeline. This is my second video on the topic. My last one talked about how the timeline was stupid, but this time I'm going to do the opposite. I would like to defend it. There is this idea in the Zelda community that Nintendo doesn't care about the timeline, that they don't care about the lore, that they never cared about how one game connects to another, and that the timeline is for the most part a fan invention. One that Nintendo felt forced to capitulate to in 2011 by releasing the Hyrule Historia, which had the official timeline. This opinion and attitude has always haunted the Zelda fanbase, but I feel like it's worse now. I feel like for whatever reason, I'm having this argument more often today. Many people sincerely believe that the timeline is just fanfiction. Some people go further and say that they like to see the Zelda games as retellings of the same legend, with the differences owing to the tendency of legends to change over time. And that's fine, it's a perfectly okay way of enjoying the series. But it isn't true. The games are not a series of legends told by an unreliable narrator. The Zelda timeline was never a fan invention. Nintendo always meant for the games to connect to one another. You could argue that they did it badly. Many of the lore enthusiasts and timeline enthusiasts often do. You can claim that they had poor planning or they made mistakes. But what you can't argue was that there was no intent to connect the games. The intent was there. And in this video I'd like to show exactly that. First, I'll show how all of the important games were explicitly connected to each other as sequels or prequels or what have you. I'll do that through some in-game evidence, but also out-of-game evidence like interviews with the developers saying as much. And then secondly, that it made perfect sense for people to be hopeful for Nintendo's treatment of the lore. So first, you have The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. On page 3 of the Zelda 2 manual, it says, "At the end of a fierce fight, Link overthrew Ganon, took back the Triforce and rescued Princess Zelda. However, is it all really finished? Many seasons have passed since then. This confirms that Zelda 2 is a sequel to Zelda 1, and the protagonist is the same Link that we had before. The first one is easy, I don't think I have to go into more detail than that. This is a little unrelated, but when rereading this manual, I thought it was funny that they established the idea that all future women of the royal family would be named Zelda in honor of the original, because this might have been an attempt to future-proof the series so that they could keep using Zelda for each princess and it not being weird. But they never got to make use of that since they kept making prequels and games that happened before Zelda 2. Okay, the third game that they made was A Link to the Past, and A Link to the Past was a prequel to the original Zelda. In the manual they have the backstory for Ganon, and the first time he's referenced in his human form, Ganondorf. In the Link to the Past Nintendo Player's Guide, page 4 says, "Although The Legend of Zelda appeared first in the series of Zelda adventures, it actually takes place many years after the third game." And finally, Miyamoto says as much. In an interview regarding A Link to the Past, he says, "This time I will explain the meaning of the story scenario, Triforce, which is set in the era before the previous two works and approach the core of the legend. Next is Link's Awakening, which is a sequel to A Link to the Past. In the Link's Awakening manual it says, though you fulfilled the Hyrulean prophecy of the legendary hero and destroyed the evil tyrant Ganon, the land of Hyrule enjoyed only a precarious peace. Who knows what threats may arise from Ganon's ashes. The final boss of Link's Awakening is a shape-shifting nightmare, and some of the shapes that it takes are bosses from A Link to the Past. Now, for Ocarina of Time, there are multiple interviews with many different people that talk about how Ocarina was originally envisioned to be the imprisoning war described in A Link to the Past. The imprisoning war was part of Ganondorf's backstory. Ganondorf goes to the Golden Land where the Triforce is, gets it, transforming the Golden Land into the Dark World. Then the King's Knights and 7 Wise Men go to war with Ganon's army, and they manage to seal him inside. So Ocarina of Time was a prequel. It was attempting to depict the events of the Link to the Past manual. It had Ganondorf as a human, who was a king of thieves, that managed to get into the Sacred Realm and grab the Triforce. There are 7 sages to replace the 7 Wise Men. They seal Ganondorf away and the knights are replaced by Link. And at the very end it even shows Ganondorf transforming into his pig-like Ganon form. Then there's Majora's Mask, which I won't spend time on since it's an obvious sequel. And then finally we get to Wind Waker. And I think we need to spend extra time here. We need to give this one special attention, because I believe this is the source of the conflict. As you can see from everything I've described so far, it's odd that this would be such a contentious issue, because I can see why lore nerds would bicker amongst themselves as to the exact position of Four Swords Adventures, for example. But the fact that Nintendo wanted the games to connect is so obvious up to this point that it's strange it would be contentious at all. My theory is that what people take issue with is the split timeline that happened in Ocarina of Time. To recap what happened, at the end of Ocarina of Time, you defeat Ganondorf, but Zelda decides to send Link back to the past so he can live out his childhood. This creates two timelines. In the adult timeline, Zelda persists. She and the rest of Hyrule go forward in time without Link. This leads into Wind Waker. The child timeline is the timeline Link is sent back to, and this one leads into Twilight Princess. Link is able to warn the royal family and have Ganondorf executed. I actually really like this timeline split, primarily because every single Ganondorf is the same man. It's the same Ganondorf every time. It's not a reincarnation, it's not a different guy. This is the same Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time in all three games. At least up to this point. Now, like I said, I suspect that this is the reason why people have trouble believing in the timeline. Anytime I've had this discussion with somebody and I've had to explain that no, they were always connected, this timeline split has been the sticking point. And I've come to the conclusion that it's the sticking point because it's simply too cool for Nintendo. It's actually too good a story beat. It's hard to believe that it's intended, and it's easier to believe that fans just noticed some peculiarities that were later retconned into being what Nintendo meant all along. But it turns out, no, Nintendo just did a good job with it. When I was a small baby and I played Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, I did not visit internet forums. I didn't look at things online, really. All I had were the games. And even so, just playing the games, just playing Ocarina and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, there being a timeline split was my default assumption. It's what I think people would naturally assume. But thankfully, we have pretty definitive evidence that this was intended. For Twilight Princess, there's an interview with Aonuma, in which he says, "The Wind Waker is parallel. In Ocarina of Time, Link flew 7 years in time. He beat Ganon and went back to being a kid, remember? Twilight Princess takes place in the world of Ocarina of Time, 100 and something years after peace returned to Kid Link's time. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Kid Link and Zelda have a little talk, and as a consequence of that talk, their relationship with Ganon takes a whole new direction. In the middle of this game, Twilight Princess, there's a scene showing Ganon's execution. It was decided that Ganon to be executed because he'd do something outrageous if they left him be." This interview happens in February 2007, predating the Hyrule Historia by years, and it's only 3 months after Twilight Princess came out. So if Aonuma did in fact get this from the fans, he wouldn't have had much time to lurk on forums to steal their ideas. But just in case some people still think that avenue is open, there's also an interview from 2002 with both Miyamoto and Aonuma. They are asked, "Where does the Wind Waker fit in the overall Zelda series timeline?" Aonuma says, "You can think of this game as taking place over 100 years after Ocarina of Time. You can tell this from the opening of the story, and there are references to things from Ocarina located throughout the game as well." Miyamoto then asks, "Well wait, which point does the 100 years start from?" Aonuma says, "From the end." Miyamoto then says, "No, I mean, as a child or as a..." Aonuma responds, "Oh right, let me elaborate on that. Ocarina of Time basically has two endings of sorts. One has Link as a child, and one has him as an adult. This game, The Wind Waker, takes place 100 years after the adult Link defeats Ganon at the end of Ocarina." So, that's pretty definitive. 2002, long before Twilight Princess came out, long before the Hyrule Historia, Miyamoto and Aonuma already knew about the separate timelines and were able to clearly articulate them. The timeline always existed, it was always meant to be split. The 2002 Wind Waker interview is the biggest nail in that particular coffin. Now these are the important ones. I could keep going, but just for brevity, you should take my word on it. All of the Zelda games either were clear sequels or prequels, or we had developer comments telling us where exactly they were supposed to go. There was an intent to how they were supposed to be connected, even if we as nerds could point out, hey, there's a problem with how you're connecting this here, or there's a mistake here, or there's a lore inconsistency here. Not the point. The point is, they were supposed to be connected. Let's move forward a little and talk about Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword comes out in 2011, and it depicts the very beginning of the timeline. And it does its best to coalesce all of the old lore. It depicts the creation of the Master Sword. It explains that the green tunic comes from the uniforms that they wore at the Academy. It introduces Demise and tries to explain why there's a repeating cycle with Link, Zelda, and Demise incarnations. It's the game that seems to care the most about the lore. And 2011 is the same year that they came out with the Hyrule Historia, which had their official timeline. So I need you to understand from a lore nerd's perspective that this is the milieu that we Zelda lore nerds lived in, where every game had been connected to every other game. And Nintendo seemed to care about the lore more than they ever had. Breath of the Wild 2 seemed to connect to the older Zelda games. You can hear Fi in the Master Sword, Zelda makes explicit references to past heroes. And Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were both directed by Fujibayashi, who was the director of Skyward Sword, the game that's most heavily involved in lore. What I'm basically saying is that it was not unreasonable for Zelda fans to be invested in their series' lore. Every indication pointed to Nintendo being invested in the series' lore. So if you see a Zelda fan that got disillusioned after Tears of the Kingdom came out, you should be nice to us. Because we weren't stupid, we were just wrong. That's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.